Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India on Monday sought investments from the United Arab Emirates in key sectors like infrastructure, highways, ports, airports, renewable energy and defense as the two sides discussed a joint strategy to offset the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. The matters came up during a virtual meeting of the India UAE Joint Commission on Trade, Economic and Technical Cooperation, which was co-chaired by External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar and his UAE counterpart Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan. The two sides assessed their cooperation over the past few months in the fight against COVID-19 and discussed a joint strategy to offset the economic and social impact of the pandemic on both countries. In this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the deepening relationship between India and the UAE. Joining me on the program today are Navdeep Singh Suri, former ambassador, Pramit Pal Chaudhary, Foreign Affairs Editor of the Hindustan Times, and Ramupendra Das, Head Center for Regional Trade, Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. All right, Ambassador, let me begin the program with you first. Let's understand the key takeaways really from the virtual meeting of the India UAE Joint Commission.
You know, the Joint Commission is an annual mechanism at the foreign ministers level that gives both sides the opportunity to review the entire gamut of the bilateral relationship. It has different working groups on areas like defense and security and trade and investment and so on. You know, the fact that they were able to meet despite the COVID really shows the earnestness of both sides. I should add that in addition to the Joint Commission, you know, we have various other elements in the architecture of our relationship. We also have, for example, a high-level task force on investment, which is headed from our side by the Commerce and Industry Minister, Piyush Goyal, and from the UAE side by Sheikh Hamad bin Zayed Al Nahyan, who is also the Managing Director of the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. And the reason I mention this is that ADIA, Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, is the world's second largest sovereign wealth fund with assets of something upwards of 850 or $900 billion. And then there's Mubadala, which again is a very large sovereign fund with assets of something like $250 billion. So they have a huge capacity to invest. They have been investing. We had during the 2017 visit of the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi as our chief guest on Republic Day, we had this announcement that UAE would invest maybe $75 billion into India. And one of the things that really has been a challenge for us is how to translate those intentions into reality. Because remember, it's not a loan, it's not a grant, it's investment. And investment needs fungible projects where an investor can put money and expect a decent return. Just to give you a quick heads up, ADIA, for example, became the first investor, the anchor investor into India's National Infrastructure Investment Fund. They put $1 billion into it. They put significant money into renewable energy, into highways, into financial assets, and so on. But the challenges continue. So when I read the statement coming out of the meeting, I must say I had a bit of a wry smile on my face because I read about the investments into ports and into airports as examples of infrastructure investment. But ADIA actually has committed to invest $500 million into the Mumbai and Navi Mumbai airport. And that has been dragging through the legal processes for the last 2 years. And it can be quite frustrating for an investor because from India's perspective, that large, chunky investment from a sovereign fund, which is long-term, patient money, is the kind of investment that we want. So I just want to say the intent is very good, but there's still work to be done to really make it realize its potential.
Absolutely. We need something tangible, not just the intent is what you're suggesting. All right, Pramit, let me bring you to the picture now. So how has the India-UAE relationship grown over the past few years? We've seen it reach new heights.
Yes, as Ambassador Suri would know himself, since he was the architect of quite a bit of this, we have seen the UAE become one of our 3 or 4, arguably most important economic and strategic partners. from a relationship that in the past used to be actually quite testy. At the heart of it, I would argue, was a decision by the Crown Prince, by the royal family, to see India as part of their future, and not just as a source of labor or some investment. They recognized that their earlier strategic investments in Pakistan were essentially a waste of time. They are concerned that the United States is leaving the Middle East bit by bit. And their sense that the future of what they want to see in the UAE economy, whether it's moving away from their dependence on oil, moving into technology, becoming a bigger financial center than they already are, tying up with India makes perfect sense. It's the obvious external player to bring into that future perspective. In addition, because they're very nervous about what's happening around their region, they have looked upon bringing more external players who can help their overall strategy of trying to stabilize the Middle East, maintain a degree of peace, and ensure that the economies in that region work together. So you've seen UAE, for example, now has ceased to support Saudi Arabia's original interventions in Yemen and the civil war there. Argued that we need to work out some sort of settlement. You saw them now reach out to Israel and formalize a relationship with them. They earlier began building bridges to Iran, a country that they had originally taken a relatively hostile position to. But you can see the UAE positioning itself overall as trying to be the great stabilizer of the Persian Gulf. And India is a good external player to bring into the picture. We don't have the baggage that a lot of other external players have. We are very close by. I mean, they were literally just across the Arabian Sea. And we have, if you look at it, we are strategic partners to both Iran and Israel, which is probably the only country in the world that has that kind of a relationship. Plus, we're close to the United States. We have good relationships with Russia. Other than China, who itself has never expressed any concerns about our presence in the Gulf area, we have a perfectly sound relationship with all the major players, external and internal, in the Gulf, other than Pakistan.
Right. Okay. Points taken. Let me take the points that you're making forward now, and also the points that the ambassador was making forward with Ram Bhupendra Das. From an economic point of view, how significant is the relationship for both India and the UAE? Because the UAE is India's third largest trading partner, and we've seen the ties also grow manyfold in the recent past as well. So how do we ensure that we take this up a notch, and how important is the economic relationship between the two countries?
Well, as you very rightly said, UAE and India trade and economic relationship is very significant. And when you focus just on trade, the total trade, bilateral trade, you would find mention of US and China and European Union as a bloc. But little do you see discussions around UAE, which is always in the top 3 trade partners if you go by total trade. And this is one area where India had enjoyed trade surplus until very recently. And it is good that the trade is much more balanced now. It has risen from $45 odd billion to around $60 billion. I mean, since this COVID-19, which will definitely have some effect. But the very fact that this kind of jump in bilateral trade and touching almost $60 billion US in 2018 and remaining in the top 3 most important trade partners of India is something that is never under discussion, which only shows that how narrow-minded our trade discourse has been thus far. Having said that, the point which Ambassador Suri was mentioning, and in fact I have been following him earlier when he was there, the multiplier effect of India-UAE relations would definitely come about through the bilateral investments. in which I look at bilateral investments from UAE because they are relatively capital rich or capital surplus country. And here India has emerged as an important FDI host, especially given the ease of doing business and other parameters improving for India. Though it is not exactly on a pan-India basis, but things are improving. I mean, nobody can deny that. And given this complementarity that India is ready to serve as Make in India manufacturing hub, and there, we have UAE, which is our natural partner in terms of trade already. We can step up the bilateral investment relations, and the areas which I see are going to be cutting edge, because the kind of developments that have happened in UAE, the kind of investments that they have made, I look at their investments as new areas of R&D and smart cities and civil aviation and, many of the cutting edge, technologies of artificial intelligence, robotics, and digital economy as well.
Right. So let me take the discussion forward now. Ambassador Suri, you mentioned it yourself in your opening remark. The pandemic has not been a deterrent really as far as ties between the two countries are concerned. What has been the level of cooperation between the two nations during the pandemic too? Because they've not kept quiet during this whole period. There has been a lot of cooperation between the two countries.
And there has been indeed, and some of that unfortunately had to deal with the return of migrant workers from UAE, all of the Vande Bharat flights, because remember that we have 3.4 million Indians in UAE. In a country of less than 10 million, that's over a third of the country's population. Since Professor Das has covered the trade and investment side and Pramit kind of gave the big picture on regional issues, I just wanted to say that when you look at our bilateral relationship, I would bring out 5 or 6 key segments, if you will, to enable an analysis of it. The first is political, which is what happens in government-to-government relations, and whether it is COVID or no COVID. Prime Minister Modi often speaks with Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed. Dr. Jaishankar often speaks with Sheikh Abdullah as the foreign minister. National Security Advisor Mr. Doval often speaks with Sheikh Tahnoon, who is their National Security Advisor, and there is actually a very high degree of cooperation at that level between the leaders. I want to point out something that many people don't take sufficient cognizance of, which is the extent to which UAE went to support us on issues that mattered to us. They went out of their way to extend an invitation to Mrs. Sushma Swaraj to be the guest of honor at an OIC foreign ministers meeting in Abu Dhabi. The Pakistanis threw tantrums. Mr. Qureshi, Imran Khan, all of them said that if the Indian foreign minister is invited to an OIC meeting, we will boycott it and we'll walk out. And yet they stood firm. And when the meeting happened on the 1st of March last year, our foreign minister was at the high table and the Pakistani seat was vacant. Later, when we abrogated Article 370, UAE became pretty much the first Arab country to say this is India's internal business. And those things mattered to us. At a time when Pakistan was creating a campaign against India, they awarded their country's highest civilian award to Prime Minister Modi. So I just want to give you an idea of how deep the political relationship is, that they're willing to step up on issues that matter to us. On security, not a lot is spoken. But if you ask our agencies, they'll tell you amongst the top 5 countries around the world in terms of intelligence sharing, cooperation, preemptive actions, sending back bad guys like Farooq Takla, who was an aide of Dawood Ibrahim, cracking down on jihadi groups which may have affiliations in India. All of that which doesn't make it to the media happens quietly behind the scenes and very effectively. And that's important to understand because it shows again the depth of the relationship. Energy. We used to say that we are big buyers of hydrocarbons and UAE produces a lot of hydrocarbons. So it is a kind of a buyer-seller relationship. But look at the strategic nature now. Our first strategic petroleum reserve in Bangalore was set up with oil from Abu Dhabi National Oil Company. The second one will probably be on the same. And the template is also something that the Saudis are looking to use as we go forward with larger strategic petroleum reserves. Our first oil concessions came in UAE, from a producing reserve in the lower Zakum basin. And now we are prospecting onshore as well. Remember, ONGC Videsh was looking for oil from Venezuela to Vladivostok. But in the Gulf, the richest place for oil, we never got a foot in the door until 2 years back. The agreement between ADNOC and the Saudi Aramco to set up a $50 billion West Coast oil refinery with half the investment coming from them and half the oil coming from them, again tells you how far we move beyond just the commercial trading aspect to a much tighter strategic fit. Again, when we speak about the diaspora, it's not just the Indian workers. It's also the top layer of the business community, which is now investing into India, into sectors like real estate, hospitality, tourism, healthcare, even manufacturing. Last year, or 28, the last full year that I saw figures for, of the $78 billion of remittances that India received, 19 billion came from UAE. A quarter of our total remittances globally came from UAE. So that's kind of tells you about the intensity and size of the relationship. And I could delve into other aspects if time permits.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you for putting it so well, Ambassador, and thank you for taking us through all those other facets of the relationship as well. Pramit, let's talk about the pandemic now and how it has impacted the UAE. And UAE also seems to be one of those first few nations to fully emerge out of the pandemic as well. So is there a lesson from that for India too?
Well, it was one of the first, as you mentioned, to suffer, partly because Iran, as you know, was one of the major centers, original epicenters of the disease. And they were it spread from there to a lot of the Gulf countries. I have to admit, I haven't followed the UAE, how they've actually handled the epidemic, the pandemic. But the departure of a large number, as the ambassador mentioned, a large portion of their workforce and their population are actually foreigners. And a large number of those then left, not just to India, but also to Bangladesh, Nepal, and to other Arab countries, Egyptians and so on. Also, many of them left. So this automatically, I think, made the population much more manageable. But it's a very disciplined state, both Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And so therefore, it's not too hard to see how they could both maintain the testing arrangements as well as contact tracing and the lockdown that was there. But it didn't require all that much. It was much more manageable there than it has been, for example, for India. I'm not too sure that they have lessons for us. The UAE is a very different kind of country than India, both in terms of size and structure.
Right. Yes, Ambassador, you wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say that, on COVID-19, yes, what Pramit is saying, that they've handled it pretty efficiently, pretty effectively. They have the tools, they have the resources, they have the systems in place, and it's a country of less than 10 million. But the extent to which they have been successful in handling it is reflected in one very simple fact, that the next IPL from September 19 is going to be held in UAE. The games are going to be played in Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and Sharjah stadium, and they are putting together the standard operating procedures and the protocols for testing and everything to make sure that the teams stay safe. And let's see, I think whether they are able to allow spectators to come in certain numbers with the caveats. I wouldn't be surprised if you saw at least half full sporting facilities. I was in a conversation yesterday with a panel that included Ravi Shastri, and he was all praised for the kind of arrangements that the Emiratis are making, and also the psychologically positive effect that it will have to finally see some sport taking place somewhere that people can take their minds off COVID and watch something else.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so Ramapitra Das, from a trade perspective, how do we diversify the existing basket? We need to look at new avenues. Even the UAE is looking for new avenues. What should be the key focus areas going forward?
Well, as I was mentioning, a lot holds promise in the areas of trade in services, which could be, within the diversified trade basket. Because thus far, if you see, goods trade were very prominent. So the 60 billion US dollar of bilateral total trade is goods. But there are various areas of services where already we have linkages, but I think we can augment them. For instance, it was also referred to by Pramit and Ambassador Suri. I think education is one area which is very critical as far as putting up the systems in place, and especially now with the unfolding of online education. So I think using the online platform in education, the linkages across think tanks, and not only the scholastic, classroom kind of teaching. So that joint collaboration in research in different fields, both scientific and social sciences, coupled with many of the areas in which health, and which has got pronounced because of the pandemic as well, health services. Because see, health is a sector which will have its implications on goods side in terms of pharmaceuticals as well as medical devices. That is one. And the health services, from paramedical staff, to very skilled doctors. So the entire skill spectrum gets covered. So I would see health services trade also getting, contributing to the diversification of bilateral trade. And I also would like to emphasize not to see investment, the foreign direct investment and trade of goods, trade in goods and trade in services, but actually see the trade investment linkages. Many times, you invest in something and then you buy back. And that's something very interesting. So I would see, in terms of diversification of trade, more and more services getting included in the trade in goods basket, and see the interlinkages across trade in goods, trade in services, and everywhere.
Yes, Ambassador, go ahead.
Sorry, I don't want to cut into Pramit's time, but I just wanted to add on specifically on trade that one of the most interesting things that's happening is the efforts to create an India UAE food corridor. UAE is very concerned about its food security. They import pretty much all of their food. So there's a major investment proposal that involves procurement, it involves logistics, it involves warehouses and cold storage chains, it potentially involves fisheries and poultry as well. And the objective is that last year, I think our total food exports to UAE were about $2.5 billion. To treble it in the next 5 years is the ambition. And to really see whether you could create first this corridor to UAE. There's no reason, according to us, for UAE to be importing chicken from Brazil when we are next door, and so on. But also to see whether we could extend that corridor then to the other Gulf countries, because all of them, given that they are arid desert countries, would remain dependent on food imports for a considerable time. So can we utilize the logistics capacity of Jebel Ali free zone, for example, and ship out food products also to Muscat or to Jeddah or to other places in the Gulf? So I think purely in terms of diversification, watch this space, because there are significant things happening there.
Absolutely. All right. So the food corridor is something that we are going to keep our eyes open for, and hopefully we'll see some progress and some positive developments there on that front. All right, Pramit, how do we further scale up the ties going forward? Clearly, the ties are in a good place, but we also need to ensure that they go to a even newer heights. So how do we do that?
Well, I think, as the ambassador had mentioned, It continues to be difficult. One difficulty continues to be the inability of us to get what is effectively a huge amount of finance from Abu Dhabi into the long-term investments of the Indian economy. This means infrastructure, power, railways, ports. For example, we see that now with Japan. We're seeing that with the Canadians. Canadian pension funds have put in $60 billion in the country already, and that hasn't even been with government backing. So we need to see that coming through from the UAE. And I gather part of the problem is that a lot of their risk officers of in their investment funds tend to be European or American who don't really get India at all. So that's one of the areas we really need to develop. We have a good trading relationship, but the heart of it has got to be the investment side. On the military side, the UAE had promised to buy weapons from India. We don't make too many, but there are some areas like artillery and so on, which we are very good at. We still haven't seen much movement on that front. And again, we seem to be running into institutional barriers. And that's going to be again important because when you start to buy weapons and you start to build an undercurrent to the strategic relationship, that's much more important. And so those are some of the key areas that I think that we need to be seeing. We already have them on paper. We just need to see them actually appear on the ground.
Okay, we need to see it fructify at some point in time is what you're suggesting. All right, very quickly, Ramabindra Das, what's the best way forward?
Well, we have moved from strength to strength, and I think the relationship is moving towards a comprehensive economic and strategic partnership. And as these dimensions were highlighted, in recent times, you have seen the political level exchanges at the highest level, also recognizing, each other's contributions through, be it awards and other things. So the Indian diaspora and the political leadership, the kind of vision that they have, I think the scaling up would fructify on ground if we look at this whole partnership in a comprehensive and economic and strategic, both intertwined together.
Absolutely. And Ambassador, close the show for us with a quick concluding remark on whether there are certain areas of the bilateral relationship that need special attention.
As both Pramit and Professor Das said, really it is investment on which we should focus. The intent is there, the desire is there, but let me tell you, they put well over $500 million into two of our largest renewable energy companies. Those companies invested significantly in Telangana to develop renewable energy projects. Guess what? A new government comes, says, I don't buy these power purchase agreements, wants to reopen the whole thing. And these guys are in shock. They say, hey, what happens to contractual sanctity? So I think we need to understand that we are a pretty unique country, and we have to devise really the systems that a state election and a change in government shouldn't impact in this manner, because infrastructure investments are long-term capital. That's patient capital. And these are typically with a 20-year time horizon that people invest. So I think it's, whether it's the legal processes that we are seeing with the GVK deal in Mumbai, which is crucial for us because it's not just Mumbai, it's Navi Mumbai, which won't get built anytime soon if these legal challenges continue. So I think while the government has done a lot in terms of ease of doing business, the federal nature of our system and the nature of our judicial processes continue to really hamper us in many areas. And we really need to work on this to attract the kind of investments that will enable us to take this to its full potential.
All right. On that note, then, I'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. What's coming out of this discussion is that the relationship has reached new heights. From being testy in the past, the ties have progressed manyfold, both strategically and economically. The intent of the ties and projects are very good. We now need something tangible. UAE is emerging as an important power in the Persian Gulf, and it makes sense for the UAE to have the support of India. And it also makes sense for India to have UAE's support, especially in the region and in the subcontinent. With that, it's a wrap. See you again